My name is Ed Kaplan. I am Professor Emeritus in the Department of Pediatrics and was, before I became Emeritus, an adjunct professor in the School of Public Health at the university. I initially came to the University of Minnesota Department of Pediatrics in 1965 as a public health service lieutenant commander and was sent here to work with Dr. Louis Wanamaker, who was and still is a legend in the Department of Pediatrics. I stayed and worked in Dr. Wanamaker's laboratory and learned how to spell streptococcus in the first couple of years that I was here. We did some exciting studies. I had a gap of between 68 and 70 when I went to the University of Washington in Seattle for more training, and then joined the faculty here as an assistant professor in pediatrics in July of 1970. My professional career has been continuous here in the department until I became emeritus at the beginning of 2014. I have had a very exciting and stimulating career here, and had the benefit of coming to Minnesota during what many consider to be the golden age of the Department of Pediatrics here. The Department of Pediatrics was at the time an outstanding example of both academic and clinical pediatrics. And many of the senior professors who were here at this time are legends in themselves in terms of what they have done and the importance of the studies that were done in the beginning in the 60s and 70s. And I consider myself to be extraordinarily lucky, because those were my mentors when I came here. And even when I joined the faculty in 1970, I remained here in the department and worked in the laboratory, and it was one of those wonderful times when one was able to do clinical research and bench research in clinical medicine, and teaching of medical students and residents and so forth. In about 1976, I was promoted to associate professor, and then later, a few years later, to full professor in the department. At that time, unfortunately, during those years, Dr. Wanamaker had passed away unexpectedly. And you might say I inherited a lot of his previously functioning laboratory, although nobody could take his place, me or anyone else. Close after that, our laboratory became designated as a World Health Organization reference laboratory, and this opened up a whole new field of interest for me, because we were one of 5 worldwide such designees, and it let me go around the country, not only around the country, but around the world in teaching and collaborating with research. As I said, at the end of 2013 or the beginning of 2014, I became emeritus, and that doesn't mean that I stopped doing anything. I think it just means that I changed to make my center of operations at home. Our laboratory closed a couple of years for that, and I would be remiss if I didn't give credit to the many people, particularly Dwight Johnson, who worked in the lab with us for years. That's kind of the story of where I am, and I consider myself to be extremely fortunate to have had the opportunity to be mentored by some of the great names in pediatrics. And I should also mention, among many others, Dr. Paul Quee, who is still retired, and we still take advantage of not only his knowledge, but also his very famous Ole and Lena jokes, which he talked about. I just, before I finish this part, I would like to say that during all of this time, I did clinical medicine, both in pediatric infectious diseases, and then later on in my career, mostly in pediatric well, initially in pediatric cardiology and then later in pediatric infectious diseases. And again, I don't think from a personal point of view, I could have had it any better than I did.
Mentorship is a very big element of both residency and beyond. Do you mind talking more about kind of mentorship during your career, as well as who are some other important?
No, and I should hasten to say that the couple of names that I mentioned specifically during the previous comments are an extremely incomplete number of the great people that I had the chance to work for and with over the years. And I'm glad you raised the question about mentorship, because I think it's probably among the most important aspects, not only of the mentee, but also for the mentor. If the mentee has an example to follow, it's important. The very first manuscript that I wrote with Dr. Wanamaker, which was close to 1970, one way or another, when I did what I thought was a wonderful job and gave it to him, it came back with red pencil marks all over it. And when I asked him if he had had a nosebleed on my paper, he didn't think it was very humorous at all to do that. But they were criticisms that one, if they were smart, took very carefully. And those of us who had gone through our residency, and especially during the fellowship, one hopefully became an accomplished personal teacher and personal mentor to those who followed us. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is. And I've kept up that role through all these years, even after retiring. And the last one that I mentored was a young woman who just graduated from the U undergraduate and is now in graduate school. And it is there. I just talked on the phone this weekend with a person who spent time and worked in our laboratory, and she's now gotten her PhD at let me say it right, MIT, either MIT or Harvard. And to see their career is really very self-satisfying.
How would you describe your mentorship style?
Oh, I would hope that I'm not considered to be mean. I kind of enjoy making light of things. I consider working with students and others to be really a privilege, and I'm known for telling jokes, I guess, because it's the way it is, and it carries on to the laboratory, where I always said that those that were in my laboratory, or even the clinical fellows that were there, I treated them as I was treated, as if they worked with me and not for me. And I think there's a difference. You have to, establishing collegiality is one of the highlights of, I don't know if highlights is the right word, or one of the essentials of being a good mentor. And if mentees get out of line, they need to have their rear ends kicked, politely, of course. But that was true. And I learned that again from coming here. If you go back and look at the tradition of either the Division of Pediatric Cardiology here, or the Division of Pediatric Infectious Diseases, our graduates went on to make distinguished, go on with distinguished careers and so forth. At one time, for example, I think every head, or certainly at least 3/4 of the heads of pediatric infectious disease in Canada were graduates of our program. And the same is true for pediatric cardiology. Now that says something. It either says that they did well despite what we did for them, or we actually worked with them, and they're still wonderful friends.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard that as well, the kind of a sense of collegiality and, and hand in hand with mentorship. And do you feel like, because I know that I, can hear stories of kind of the hierarchy of, residents, fellows, attendings, just kind of this blatant, when you started with the program, did you kind of feel that hierarchical structure was very rigid, or kind of do you think that has changed a lot over time?
Good question. It took maybe, when I was here the first time, it took maybe 6 months for me to fully understand that while I respected and learned from all of my mentors, that didn't mean that everybody loved everybody else. There was the usual collegiality that was there. There's a wonderful picture that I have that was taken many years ago, and it was of Dr. Wanamaker, Dr. Quee, and Dr. Frank Top, who trained here and went on to a wonderful career. And with the exception of Dr. Wanamaker, we were all in the hall on the 6th floor of Deal Hall, leaning against the wall and smoking our pipes. And you knew we were either discussing a patient or telling the last funny thing that happened to us on the way to work. And it was, and I think that's the way it's going to be. You don't have to, um, to use the word, you don't have to like everybody that you work with, but you need respect for them, and more to the point, you need to be committed. I don't mind admitting to the fact that, and this is true, I think, for all of us that were in that generation, including Dr. Moeller. We went home or came to work when there was something that had to be done. We didn't go by the clock, although we may have fussed about it a little bit. But we didn't, if it was 5 o'clock, nobody punched out if there were still things to be done. And that set an example, and it still, I think, is extremely important to do it. If it's dealing with patient care can't wait till in the morning. Even if it's only talking with a family. If something needs to be done, and you had to stay late, or when, not if, when you got called at 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of January, and it was darn cold outside, you had to get up and go and come in. I think that's that's both an obligation and an opportunity to practice medicine, and especially to be involved with medical research. We had some real characters around here at that time, and one could go on with the stories that are repeatable in public, and those that are not, for weeks and weeks that are there.
Yeah, if you don't mind, yeah, imagine you're leaning against the wall with your pipe. Do you mind telling one of your favorite stories from your time with the program? I'd imagine there's probably plentiful stories to tell, but do you have any that kind of stand out in your mind?
Oh, I have a lot of them, but they're not repeatable in public. I don't think. Yeah, well, I remember, for example, and it was not meant to be funny at the time, but back in the days when the Mayo building was the university hospital at that time, before the other buildings were built, there was a coffee shop on the 3rd floor, just as you walked in the front door. And coming back from rounds one day, Dr. Quee and I and Dr. Wanamaker, and I can't remember, several others who are not here anymore, were walking through the lobby of the Mayo building, and somebody, and I don't want to put the blame on anybody, but it may have been Dr. Quee, he may fuss about that, said, let's stop for a cup of coffee. And Dr. Wanamaker looked at him and pushed his glasses back up on his nose like he usually would do, and simply said, "What's the occasion?" And that that was interpretable on several levels, but that story has been told by those of us who remember it so many times. If somebody says we should do this, that, or the other, the reply is frequently, "What's the occasion?" It was the kind of time when we all were taught about collegiality. And I think another important word other than mentorship is collegiality. That's what's really important. In the department itself, there was a pediatric wives club, and they sponsored a number of events, social events. And you did that. For example, we had, and I always thought this was good, we had potluck dinners, and they were organized such that there was a senior professor, a junior professor, a fellow, an intern, maybe I'm leaving somebody, about 5 couples would go. And these were people that you didn't get to choose, you were told who to come with. And they were at every pecking level that was there. And so that was a lot of fun. They used to sponsor what was called jungle medicine parties, where everybody got dressed up in costumes, and it was another. And there many stories go back to the jungle medicine things, but I think that's good. These days there are so many competing things that people don't want to do it. By the way, before I mention it, when Dr. McQuarrie, who was one of the first chairs of pediatrics, was head, he's the one who I think initially built this department. And there is a book in the university archives that was put together on his retirement, which was way before my time. And to show you the respect that people have for this department, outstanding pediatricians and scientists from over the country contributed a chapter each to this book. And if you want to go back and really get the sense of the tradition of this department, that goes way back before now. Now, the rules have all changed and so forth, but there are things that I personally miss.
Yeah, kind of in addition to the sense of collegiality and kind of, do you mind talking some also with your like patient relationship? Do you have any kind of patient stories that stand out to you as well?
I think all of us who've been around a long time have patient stories to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it can be summed up by saying I've been to weddings, to funerals, and served as a mentor for patients who've grown up and are thinking about things. Families still to this day will call me and ask my advice about what they should do or who they should see. Not about any of my patients. It's just that I became part of the family. And in those days, in the old days, and even to a degree, I think now, when you think what was there was really nothing medical west of here. And all of outstate Minnesota. So our patients were there, and they came before the days of helicopters. They came in air ambulances, and I can't speak for other people, but I made several of those trips with sick children to do that. So you became attached to the families. And as I look through, when looking for something else, the list on my computer, I see email addresses for many patients and their families and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of the wonderful things about pediatrics, is that it also allows for such a kind of robust opportunity for following up.
Absolutely. And that's a very important point. When I was a medical student and thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, when I started thinking about pediatrics, it all of a sudden dawned on me that I would much rather, with all the tragedy and so forth that accompanies it, I would much rather take care of a patient whose life was in front of them, rather than some of us, quote unquote, senior citizens, so whose life is behind them, basically. And it is. And some people have said that the reason I like pediatrics is because I never outgrew that stage in my own life. But it does, it is, I think that's why it's so much fun. It can be tragic, but there are experiences that we forget. One time when I was attending on the ward, a patient of one of the other physicians in the department was on a ward and was really in tough shape. And I had never met this family before. And when your child is lying there dying, you need somebody who's familiar to be with the family. And I called the guy who'd taken care of him, and his wife told me he's not there. He's at the hardware store. And I said, well, and this now was before cell phones and beepers and so forth. I said, well, what's the number? And she said, well, after the hardware store, he's going up north. And I said, please tell me what kind of car he's driving and what the license plate is, because I'm going to send the state troopers after him. I mean, I think that's in general the way most of us react, and I think the same is true today. I hope it is.
Yeah, it's kind of like the quote you said earlier, patient care can't wait until tomorrow. You know, it's always
Now
important.
try and tell that to some of the current, not just at the U, but some of the current hospitals now. And that we could talk for another day and a half about that.
Thanks for taking the time, Dr. Kaplan, and sorry for the delay. I just got off from the hospital.
One of the things I said just a few minutes ago was patient care comes first.
Yeah, that's how it goes. I'm at the VA now doing adult cardiology, so there were just a couple more patients than we anticipated, which set me a little behind.
Now that's the sooner you learn that lesson, the better off you'll be.
Right.
My father-in-law did general practice in a small town, and my mother-in-law used to say that she didn't cook dinner till she saw the whites of his eyes.
I wanted to ask you about some of the changes you saw in the field from when you first started training versus like right at the end of your career. What were some of the biggest things that changed?
I think medicine has changed remarkably in that period of time. And maybe my impression is tainted by my own experience, but I think there's a lot. Medicine has become less personal and more businesslike, if that sounds right. Physicians are in many ways wildly better educated and more broadly educated than it used to be. I started medical school in 1958 and graduated in 1962, and things were a lot different when you stop and think about the technology and so forth. One of the things that I remember from medical school, and there are darn few of them, but one of the things that I remember from medical school was being taught, when in doubt, examine the patient. And I think I'm not saying it's it's universal, but I think there's less of that these days than there used to be. I think, as we spoke about before you joined us, there is, we didn't have hours back in those days. And I like to tell the story of the very first day I was on call as a medical student, a third-year medical student. And this was down in St. Louis, and I was on the orthopedic surgery service, and I finally got home about 11 o'clock at night. And as soon as I walked in the door, the phone rang, and it was the orthopedic resident, whom I'm never forgiven, calling me to make me come back to the hospital to do a hematocrit on a patient. Now that's an extreme. And I know the guy's name. I've never forgotten it all these years. And I never will. But I think there was less watching the clock than there was watching the patient. Now, that's an arguable statement, but I think it in large part is true. On the other hand, the technology is such that when I stop and think about what we have available to us now, it makes medicine actually easier. Give you an example. In the old days, quote unquote, when a baby came in who was cyanotic, it was automatic that they got a heart cath in the middle of the night, because we had no way of knowing what it was. And we did the heart caths by ourselves. The nurses would not come in the middle of the night. Now, there's a lot to be told about a story like that, but it's the truth. And there's still a few of us around who remember that.
Versus now we have technology like echocardiography where you can just take a look.
That's exactly right. And you're on cardiology now, but a stethoscope was really important in those days. I think more important perhaps than it is now. That's all we had. And you now there's more technical to it, but you've seen on your own clinical service now. Think about if you didn't have the C-arm and you didn't have good fluoroscopy and cines and other things, what you'd be sort of up against a creek, wouldn't you? And this was true with sick babies also. So I think that's one thing that has shaped it. I think the role of administration has become much broader now. I have been known express my discomfort with administrators by inviting them to make rounds with me, and to see exactly what's all about, what's going on, and so forth. And those are things that didn't used to be. Now, whether they're better or worse, we can argue about if you want, but I certainly do not want to sound as if I still believe in the way medicine was practiced then, but I think there's a lot of give and take one way or another in terms of whether it's beneficial or not.
What about from like within the areas where you've done research? You kind of talk about the clinical status of medicine right when you started versus when you finished. How about from like within some of your research interests, where the field was when you started versus when you ended?
Well, of course, once again, technology is so improved, so advanced now that it was a lot different. But doing things in the laboratory are were much different. But just because a paper, and one of the things that bothers me when people come in and say, well, there was a paper published way back in 2012. Well, I didn't consider that to be exactly way back at that point to do that. The lab was a wonderful place. Funding for a lab was, as it has continued to be, always difficult for it. Trying to do lab work and supervise a laboratory at the same time you had clinical responsibilities is still a problem to do that. The way things are done is different, and many of them are much more civilized than I think it was at that time. And furthermore, one of the things that has transpired is that if you look at lists of people who get grants and awards, more and more of them are PhDs as opposed to MDs, which was the case as I grew up in that time. But the idea of inquiry and asking questions, I think, is the same whether you're in clinical medicine or both, or just in the laboratory.
What would you say like some of the professional achievements you're most proud of over the course of your career? What would some of those be?
Surviving is one. I'm proud. I'm proud of a lot of things that I did, and recognition is it comes after it. As you weren't here at the time, but my laboratory was a World Health Organization reference laboratory for streptococci. And that opened up all kinds of opportunities for getting airplane miles, frequent flyer miles, and seeing friends. I doubt that there is anybody else in the state of Minnesota, and maybe more than that, who is a member of the Military Medicine Society of Brazil. Those are interesting kinds of things, and that has taken me all over the world. And I was a history major when I was an undergraduate, which is another difference, I think. And I'm proud of the fact that we were able to go all over the world, not necessarily to see patients, but to work with health programs and so forth. My field of interest was strep and rheumatic fever, and which by now is a field of developing countries. My wife used to say that that I was in a country either just before or just after the revolution, but fortunately not during the revolution. So I'm very proud of that. I was a member of the Armed Forces Epidemiologic Board, which was made recommendations to the Secretary of Defense for all kinds of medical things. And so it brought up everything from paratroopers jumping out of airplanes and breaking their ankle to large epidemiologic studies. And I guess the other thing that I am proud of was something I learned from Dr. Wanamaker, my primary mentor here. And I always admired the fact that he would make observations in the clinic or on the ward. And if they were the appropriate topic, he would take that problem back to the laboratory to explain. And there's a great deal of self-satisfaction in doing that.
Nice.
And so when you see something that you don't understand in the clinic, and it dawns on you that this is unusual or unexplained, or one of the students asked, what causes this, and you don't know, to be able to take it into the laboratory, and you fail as much as you succeed, but at the same time, when you succeed, it's a wonderful feeling. So I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud of all of the friends that I have both here at the university and around the world. And there's not a week that goes by that I don't talk with some of my friends around the world on the phone.
So you mentioned your research was primarily in the area of rheumatic fever, strep. I'd love to hear some of the big lessons you got from your career of research. And it was it primarily like you were culturing bacteria like a wet lab? Was that
Oh,
sort of
yes.
experiments or?
Yeah, yeah, it was a wet lab. One of the things that I didn't know anything about was epidemiology, and we did a lot of epidemiologic studies both around here and across the world, as a matter of fact. And if one were to look at the things that I've published, at one point, and I'm sure this is no longer true, but at one point, somewhere around 20 to 25% of the publications that my name is on were done in collaboration with somebody from abroad, from another country or another continent. Some were from the different parts and different populations, and you learn from those things, and you learn how to avoid making again the mistakes that you made before. And I think anybody who's honest in the laboratory will tell you that we all make mistakes. And so I think that's one of the most important things. Scientifically and epidemiologically, I did a lot with epidemiology of streptococci, both their bacteriology and their epidemiology, and in fact the immunology. But a lot of that was done before the technology that we now have that people can take advantage of there. Don't know whether
Thanks.
I answered that properly or not, but
That's helpful. So both kind of like bench wet lab research, but then also a lot of epidemiologic research, much of which, like a quarter of which was in collaboration with people from abroad.
yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I still do that. Despite my afternoon naps, I have time to do that. But since I've been retired, I've worked with some colleagues in Europe on the history of medicine in Europe, which is something I would never have dreamed of doing 20 years ago there. And it's been more fun. You have learned, for example, about the Kaplan-Meier test, right?
Right, like those plots of survival over time.
Yeah, the survival curve, right. Well, the Kaplan is not me, so you can do that. But the Kaplan who did, well, first of all, that paper, which was published in 1958, is the most quoted paper in mathematics and statistics. And the 11th, this is a couple years ago now, the 11th most common scientific paper in terms of counting publications. And I can't remember how many thousand times that it's been quoted in the literature. Well, to the story, I got an email one day from a guy knew nothing about her, nothing, is a radiation oncologist in the Netherlands. And he asked me if I was related to the Edward L. Kaplan in the Kaplan-Meier curve. And of course I wasn't, but that Kaplan had family roots down in Owatonna. And so we spent 3 years doing a history of the Kaplan-Meier curve, and we interviewed people. We went into the National Archives, things that I would never 20 years ago have thought that I would have done. He and I and another a collaborator who is a medical historian, another Dutchman who lives in Belgium, had just written a paper on the mortality in Amsterdam between 1551 and 2021. Now, that's a far piece away from streptococcus, although scarlet fever was a big issue, but plague and those kinds of things. So yes, there, but when you stop, you don't really stop if you do that. I've seen a paper describing the outbreak of plague in Geneva in the 17th century, if I remember correctly. Now, it had been written in French and it had never been translated into English. And I don't speak French. I can mumble through it, but that's not it. But we got that translated, and to look at the way public health was done in Switzerland in the 17th or 18th century, it's just amazing. They were a whole lot smarter than we give them credit for. And what brought that to mind was I was looking in the paper this morning about the scare of polio coming back in this country.
Right.
There's one case of paralytic polio that's been in New York City, but they've started looking at that by wastewater examination. And people didn't have that at that time. So you keep doing things if your mind tells you to, and that keeps you, keeps you alive and working.
What advice would you have for people who are just at the beginning of their careers, kind of looking back over the span of yours?
Well, I'd probably start by saying you don't have to wear all whites anymore, which I did. I think you find your niche. The one thing about medicine or the biologic sciences is that there are so many roles that one could play and be stimulated every day. What causes burnout? I think it's doing the same thing every day. And that's why I think that my generation was fortunate that if if we were in clinic and a patient didn't show up or there was a break in the thing, it could go to the laboratory and do something entirely different. Keeps your mind on something different. So I think that's really important for people these days to do, is to find something that stimulates you. I, as I'm sure, well, as I'm positive many other people have done, went through the whole gamut as a medical student. And I remember to this day, I got interested in anesthesia in those days because anesthesiologists were about as close to clinical pharmacologists as they ever got back in those days. And I thought that was fascinating. And then I figured out that I'd never be able to sit still that long in there. I got interested in OBGYN because it was a good mixture of medicine and surgery. But then, and I have to be careful how I state this, my impression, which probably was wrong, was that OBGYN people were not very good surgeons. So that may just be that I didn't think I'd like that. And then I started thinking about internal medicine, and it suddenly dawned on me that I'd much rather take care of and be associated with patients who have their lives ahead of them rather than behind them.
Sure.
And so the point of your original question, that is, what advice to medical students is to find something that you like. All the stuff that you see, and medicine has become a lot better at this. All of the stuff that you see, particularly in the early years of medical school, when you're doing basic science, there is a reason for that being in the curriculum, believe it or not. And I once told my father-in-law, who was a wonderful physician, not just because he was my father-in-law, but he was in a kind of a rural county, and so he was kind of the surgeon for that county. And when I told him one day, I suspect I know more about the anatomy of the neck than you do, I had to quickly backpedal to get out of there. But it's true. I mean, in anatomy. So I mean, it's just a learning experience. I talked 2 days ago to a former mentee of mine who is a first-year medical student here now, and she made me very happy by saying it's just so much fun. And what else could you ask of anything?
Anything that we haven't talked about that you think, kind of as you're reflecting on your career, that like high points or low points or things you learned that you want to impart to future physicians?
Well, yeah, you learn that not everything you do is going to be the right thing to do, but you want to try and not make the same mistake twice as it is. You want to keep assessment. Why do we teach medical students quote papers for them. It's because, especially nowadays with so many journals and electronic media and so forth, the education of the physicians is a continuing process, and you have to understand that. You have to take time out, you have to read articles, you have to keep up with the field. And the last part of that is, don't ever forget the patient or their family.